Okay, so good morning, guys. Like I said earlier, we'll be continuing with CSS this week. So throughout the week, we are going to look at CSS layouts, and as you can see on the screen, we have two concepts we'll be touching. The display property, which isn't very difficult, is something we all know about. But then, don't worry for those who are asking how do we know about this. You would see that you know about this already. And also we have the Flexbox, which we touched last week. But then this particular class for today would actually go in depth in what Flexbox really is. So by that I mean we'll be looking at how Flexbox works. We'll be seeing the components of Flexbox and how each of these components actually work and the different properties that they have. Because the Flexbox itself is actually made up of two main components, and each of these components have their own specific properties, which means that there is no property that actually works for one that works for the other. They actually have their specific properties. So we'll be seeing all those today in today's class. So let's move on. So for today's content, we have two sections. For the first section, we have the display property. Under the display property, we'll be seeing the definition, the values, and the syntax, and we'll just run through a quick demo of how this property works. Next, we have the flexbox, which isn't new to those that attended Thursday's class last week. But if this is your first class, or if you were not there, no need to worry. I'll go over flexbox again. But now we'll go into Flexbox properly and in depth. So under this section, we'll be seeing what a Flexbox is, the features of the Flexbox, and the components of the Flexbox. As you can see on the screen, we have two components, the Flex container and the Flex item. So, so I'll be explaining each of these components and we'll be seeing the properties they have and the values associated with these properties properly. And then we'd also run through a quick demo on how both of these components actually work, because like I said, they work in different ways. So for the first section, we have display property. So the display property defines how a HTML element will appear when rendered by a browser, and it also determines if the HTML element should appear or not on the browser. So like I said before, the display property is something we know about. The only difference now is that now you get to actually see it as a property. By that I mean the displays that we have on HTML elements are basically of two types, block and inline, which we already know about. So as we all know, each every HTML element has to be in one of these categories. If it's not a block element, that means it's an inline element. If it's not an inline element, that makes it a block element. So those are the displays of HTML elements we are already aware about. But this display property we are seeing today would actually give us more power on how we want the display to be. That's why I said it's something we know about, but then having it as a property is what makes the difference, because now we have the power to really define how we want that element to appear on the browser. And then in the second line, it also says the display property also determines if a HTML element should appear on the browser or not. So this might sound funny, but throughout everything we've been doing ever since we started learning CSS and HTML, all the elements that we've had in our VS Code have always appeared on the browser. But now with the display property, you can actually determine if you want the element to appear there or not. Now, this is not some kind of error. This is like actual stuff you can do. And then somebody might be wondering, why is this property important? Now, when you probably get to do advanced stuff like JavaScript, probably some kind of technical stuff on your website, and you probably don't want to reveal something until a user performs a specific operation. The display property with some JavaScript stuff can actually make that possible. So we'll also be seeing how that happens in this class. Yes, so a quick note, the display value for most HTML elements by default is block and inline. So like I said, we are already aware of this. We talked about the block level elements and the inline level elements during the HTML class. So it's something we already know of. Yeah. But the display property actually allows a user to override this value. Yes. So by the word override, it basically means it gives you the power to change how it appears, even when it already has a default way it's meant to appear. So as you can see on the screen, we have a list of block elements which we already know of. You can see the div, the p tag, the heading 1 to heading 6, and the table tag. Now, each of these tag or elements are actually block elements, but you can also define them to be inline elements. And that's what the display property actually does for you. And likewise, we also have the inline elements on the other hand. You can see that under it we have the span, the a tag, which is called the anchor tag, the image tag, and the small tag. Now, each of these elements are not like the full set, but this is just like, a quick example of what block and inline elements are. So what the display property can actually do for us is that we can actually have every element under the block element to look as if they were inline. Likewise, we can also have all the elements under the inline to look like they are block elements. So that's what we can do with the display property. So we'll be seeing more of this later on when we get to the practical session of this class. Yeah, so first we have the display which has the value of block. So as you can see above on the syntax, the display is assigned the value of block, and there are two cases where you can use this particular syntax. Now, for case 1, if the above syntax is used to style a block element, nothing changes. And that's actually because the block level element is already a block element. So defining the display to be block is just basically you setting it to a particular value that it already holds. So that's what happens in the first case, and nothing changes. But then in the case 2, if the above syntax is used to style an inline element, the element will automatically be displayed in a block form. So this actually means that if you have a couple of inline elements and you use this particular syntax to style it by assigning the display property a value of block, those particular inline elements would appear in block form almost as if they were originally block elements, but they were not. So that's what would happen in case 2. So no need to worry, we'll be seeing an example of this when we get to, the actual coding. So for the second scenario of display property, we can see that the display is assigned the value of inline. So it also works like the first one we saw. The only difference is that in the case 1, if the above syntax is used to style an inline element, nothing changes. But if it's used to style a block element as in the case 2, the element will automatically be displayed in an inline form. So the display property just gives you more power to control how you want a particular element to be displayed, probably in block or inline form. So that's actually dependent on, on the person that is actually, coding it. So like I said before, there is a way to hide HTML elements, and it won't be an error. And that can actually be done when the display is assigned the value of none. So as you can see in the syntax above, we have the display and we have the none value attached to it. And here, the value assigned to the display is none. By using this value, the element will be hidden and the space it occupies will not be displayed on the web browser. So actually having the display property to hold this value would mean that that particular element would not appear on the browser, but it would exist on your code. And mind you, this is not a comment, this is an actual syntax that would work. So we'll be seeing that also. And then there's also a special display value, which we'll be seeing in the next slide. So let's see what that is. Okay, yes. So here we have the display value to be assigned, the display property, I mean, to be assigned the value of inline block. So I'm sure many of us are not aware of this, but for those that already know some, basics of HTML, probably in the past you might have come across this once upon a time. So yes, there's actually a way for an element to possess the property of both display, that's the inline display and the block display. And so here we have the value assigned to the display property as inline block. So by using this value, the element would actually possess the properties of both inline and block elements. So what that basically means is that it's going to the elements is actually going to appear to be inline, but it will be inline with block properties, meaning that it would actually can actually some of the properties can go from top to bottom, likewise left to right. So we'll be seeing that also. Okay, yes, so here we'll be seeing how all this works. So without wasting time, we'll be touching the display property in this section in terms of the actual coding. So let's move on to VS Code. Okay, so here we are on our editor and I would like to zoom this out a bit so you guys can see it. So I think this is enough. So for this, we'll create a new file which we'll call index.html. Yeah, so we'll be making use of the boilerplates. I believe we all know how to do that already. Yeah, so for this, we'll probably start with the most basic tags, paragraph tags and heading tags. So we'll have some paragraphs. I think three of them is actually enough. So we'll be having different content within this paragraph program. Yeah, so now we have the p tags with content inside them. And as we all know, the p tags are block level elements. So if we save this and open with live server, Now we can actually see that they all appear in a block level format. That's because they are by default they are block level elements. But with the display property, which we can actually have this to be inline. So let me probably zoom in a bit. Okay, yeah, I believe that's enough. So we'll be making use of the external CSS. Okay, probably we'll need to create one. So back to our CSS file, we'll be referencing this by the name selector, which is actually the tag name P. But since we'll probably be doing a lot of styling, let me probably use comments to, demarcate this paragraph styling. Okay. So for the P tag, we would have the display to be inline. Yeah. So if we save this and come back to our browser, you can see now that the P tags actually have all their content to be on one line as opposed to their default value, which is the block value. So this is what the display property can actually allow you to do. So we'll be trying this on different tags, but not the entire block, block level elements because there are a lot. So we probably will be touching everything, but then we'll be going through some of the basic ones that we've seen in the past. So this would also work for heading tags. Yeah, so I believe we all know how this is going to appear on the browser in the block form. So let's just quickly see that, and yeah, that's how we have it now. So going back to CSS, we'll just reference this by the tag name and make some changes to the display. The display here would be inline 2. And now everything would be on just one line. Yeah. So you see, this is what the display property can actually give to you. And even if we apply this on some, lengthy syntax like a table, it would still give you the same result. So let's try that. Have a table, T head, T body. I believe we all know how to create a table. We've had a class on this before, so shouldn't be an issue. TH. Just have two headers. Yeah, so now we have a complete table and would actually duplicate this table to have, a second one. So if we save this, it's going to appear in a block form as expected. Okay, and there we have it, the table. And as you can see, we have the first table, which is followed by the second table vertically on the screen. So when we apply the display property to this table, it's actually going to be horizontal, which means we would have this second table at this space here. So let's not waste time. Let's do that. The display here would be inline also. Yeah, as expected. So we can have our forms, our strong, any block level elements, the UL, LI, table, divs, they will all appear in this way if we actually define the display to be inline. So for now we've been, dealing with the block level elements. Let's now touch inline and see how they appear as block level elements. Okay, so here we'll comment all of this out, but before then I'll add a comment showing this to be block level elements. So next we'll be seeing some inline elements. So we'll start with the span tag. Probably have some text here too. So we'll save this and visit our browser. And yeah, we have still virtual training is currently ongoing. So you can see that this entire statement is actually rendered by two separate tags, but because they are inline elements, they are both rendered on the same line. So we would apply the display property to this and would have a different result. So here the display would be block. Save. Yeah, so that's how we have it when an inline element is actually carrying the display of block. So you can see it affects, both categories of elements, and that's how we would have it. So also we can try that with other inline elements, but we wouldn't be, doing a lot of them. Let's see. We have the anchor tag, say Google. I believe we all know the use of this tag. It's actually used, to actually direct to a link which could be internal or external. So we'll probably have the href property here, but then it's not really our interest today. Here we are just, to look at how the display of this actual elements work. So we'll save this, visit our browser. Yeah, so for now we have this to be inline, but when we change the display, we'll probably just add this hrefs. So it still gives you the same result. I just added attributes. So here we would reference this by the name, also the anchor tag. And mind you, you don't only need to reference it by the name. If you add a class name or an ID, it will still give you the same result. The only reason I'm not, using those concepts is just because, we are really dealing with the display and not selectors. Display here will be block. Also, save this. And right here, yes, so that's how we have it even with the anchor tag. So this actually affects all tags, all, probably the image tag too. Yeah, it does. So that's how the display property works with block value and inline value. So next we'll be seeing the inline block value, or we'll probably be seeing the non value. Let's see that first. So now we have different properties to have values of inline and block. So let's change the property of these two to none. And right now, when we save this and go back to our browser, you wouldn't be seeing anything displayed on the browser. Yeah. So that's how the non-value works. Now our syntax is correct, our code is concise and very, very accurate, but then the display property still, gives us the power to hide it and not reveal what we have inside there. So actually show that this has content here even when it's not displayed. If we should left right click, and you can see a panel would appear on your browser when you right click. So you have a part where it says view page source. So this would actually show you the source code of what you've been doing. Yeah, so I believe some of us who you who probably learnt about HTML in the past already know this. But if this is your first time seeing this, no problem. You can actually view the code that is being rendered on the browser, not necessarily in the IDE, that's the editor, but also on the browser too. And this is how it's done. So if we should view the page source of this particular document, you can see that we have our HTML, what's it called, document here, exactly what we have in the source, in the editor. So you can see the entire source code actually appears here, everything, including the span tags that we defined and also the anchor tags. And even the ones that are commented, they also appear here too. And then all this other code are some stuff, JavaScript functionalities from the browser that enables, this to work. So that's now our focus now. But now you can see that we actually have content on that blank page even when it doesn't appear on the screen. So that's how we have it for the non-value. So the last value would be touching would be the inline block. So here we'll create, well, any tag. Let's have a p tag, which would represent the block. And also we'll have a span tag to represent the inline. So comment this out too. So now both of these elements would actually appear the way they are meant to appear. Okay, we have the block. Looks like I missed something. Okay, inline. Okay, yeah. It's still giving the display of none here. So we'd also comment this out too. And this also. So here we have the block, a block element and an inline element. So we'd have the inline to be inline block, which is the span element. So the display here will be inline block. Now if we save this and go back to our browser, you can see the inline elements here. It still appears the way it is, but then let's really see a difference between the inline block and a normal inline element. So we'll have two span tags for this. Okay, let's call this inline block. And this will have a class name. I inline block 2. So if we save this and visit the browser, we have both on the same line. Okay. Now we have the span to be this. Okay, let's change the display here to be inline. And then we would have the other one, inline block, have the display of inline block. Okay, so that's it. So as you can see on the screen, they are both displayed on the same line, which would make you think they are both inline elements. So like I said before, the inline block values would actually give the element the properties of the block and the inline. So as we all know, a property of the inline element is the fact that they cannot, take the space on a particular line, which means they actually take the space where their content is being rendered. So if we're to add, that kind of property to the inline, it wouldn't work. But if we added it to the inline block, it would actually work because of the block attached to it. So let's quickly see that. So we'll give each of these elements a background. This will probably have blue, and the next would have red. So if we save this and still go back to the browser, we have this. So both of them now are occupying the exact space where their content is being rendered, which means right now they are showing the properties of, an inline element on full display. But now we'll really know who really is the inline element and who is the inline block element. So the next thing we'd add is the width property. And as we all know, the inline elements actually take the amount of space where the content is being rendered. So applying this to the inline element isn't supposed to work. So if we save this, go back to the browser. Okay. Okay, so this wasn't what I expected anyway, but yeah, it still worked in another way. So now the reason why you actually have the text with the red background to extend this way and not the blue one is actually because both of them are span tags. Despite the fact I'm referencing one of them with, the class name, they are both span tags. So I'm guessing the span selector actually affects both. So we'll probably change the name for that. But already we've seen the results of, what I wanted. I just wanted it to be more accurate. So we'll change this and we would have this span tag to have a class name. Call this block. So for this, we'd be referencing the first one by the class name, which is block. And now if we save this, you can see that under this particular, styling, we've assigned 200 pixels to the width property of, the class name of block, which is meant to affect the very first element, which has the display of inline. But even with that, it still doesn't affect this, and it's still able to maintain the space it has, you know, within the where the text is being rendered. So, and this also applies to the height too. If we should add the height property of 200 pixels, save this, it still yields the same result. So this basically means that the moment you set the display of any HTML property to inline, you cannot have anything like the width and the height. It won't work because the inline by default only takes the amount of space where the text is being rendered. But the inline block is pretty different. Despite the fact that it looks like inline here, those two properties would actually work when we apply them on this text with red background. So let's do that. So copy this and we'll have it here. And if we save this now, you would notice a difference in the appearance. And now we have an inline block element. So this is how you would actually know if an element is purely inline or is an inline block. So now you can see it has a height and a width of 200 pixels. And as we all know, the height and width property affects the content area of the element, which is why you have it increasing the red background. So that's it for inline and inline block. I hope you all got this. So let's move on to the next section of today's class. Yeah, so now we're in the section of Flexbox, which is, something we touched last week. But then this is actually done for the purpose of, going deeper into what Flexbox can actually do. And probably this might make the assignments quite easier. I hope so. So what is a Flexbox? A flexbox is a layout model that is used to design flexible, effective, and responsive layout structures. So that's basically what a flexbox is. It's just used to design the model of how your web page should be structured, and it also has the property of responsiveness. So by responsiveness, we actually mean that the using Flexbox would actually make your homepage not only to look good on a desktop or laptop screen, but it would also look better on a mobile screen. So that's what the Flexbox here actually does, and that's why it's a very important concept to know about. Now, before the Flexbox, layout models already existed, and before Flexbox was a thing, people who use laptops and desktop screens could actually be the only people that that could actually see content on a web page properly. For those that use mobile phones, as at that time when Flexbox wasn't out there, they actually had issues visiting the same website or the same content that another person would visit with a desktop screen. And that's because web pages back in the day were only designed to fit in the laptop and the desktop screen. But nowadays we have good displays even on mobile devices, and Flexbox is one of the concepts that actually makes that possible. So, that's the reason why we are learning this today. And then the layout models that existed that time, as you can see, were the block, the inline, the float, and the positioning. So these were the layout models that were used to define the layouts of a website before Flexbox became a thing. So for now, we are already conversant with the block and inline. As for the floats and positioning, many of us might not know that, but no need to worry. We might just touch one of these before the end of CSS, but just know that the Flexbox layout actually does better than any of these four. So let's move on. So now we are seeing the features of the Flexbox. And the first feature we can see is the fact that the Flexbox is responsive and is mobile friendly. Yeah, so like I explained before, web pages that existed before Flexbox were only perfect for laptop and desktop screens. They were not good for mobile devices. So if you probably visited a web page on a mobile device, it's going to look very ugly and not what's it called? The arrangement wouldn't be so coordinated. You would have to scroll, while visiting that website on your phone. But nowadays, with the use of Flexbox, we can actually have a mobile friendly display. So it would actually fit in to the display of any height or width or screen size of any cell phone. Also, another feature of Flexbox is that it distributes proper spaces among items. So that's another thing it does too. So your items, when you visit it on a mobile display, won't be so choked up together. There will be, amount of spaces dedicated to separate each content from, themselves. So that's a feature of Flexbox. The third feature is the fact that it properly aligns item in order. That's proper alignment of items. So the items you would have on a mobile display and on a laptop display might not be the same, but the way the Flexbox is going to, align them, it's going to be proper to the screen size. So probably on a laptop display which is bigger, you can have up to 10 items within a Flexbox and they would all appear horizontally on the screen, because the laptop screen is bigger. But on a mobile device, you can't have 10 of them appear horizontally that way, because two things would actually happen if that occurs. One, if you have it that way, the items itself would have to shrink to fit in the display, which means you won't be able to, see the actual content as clear as when you visit it on, a laptop display. So that's what Flexbox actually does. And I think the second thing you might experience if it doesn't shrink is the fact that even if it maintains the same size as the even if it maintains the same size with how it is displayed on the laptop screen, you would have to scroll through your small screen to see everything. So that means you wouldn't be able to see, you can't see everything at once. You would have to just scroll through, and I don't think anybody would want to be doing any of that today. So that's why Flexbox is very important. And lastly, Flexbox possesses flexible design structure. Yes, so this is a feature of Flexbox, and this feature probably covers the first three features that were listed. It gives you a flexible design structure. So that's all Flexbox actually does, and those are its features. Now, the Flexbox are not limited to these features. They are actually much more than this, but these are like the essential ones we should just know about now. And then a quick note, the Flexbox makes use of the display property. So you can see that the property we just learnt about before was actually very important before we can, touch Flexbox. So now we'll be making use of that property, and that would mean that the display property would have a specific value relating to Flexbox. In fact, actually the display property has a lot of values, but then some of these values are under particular concepts. As we can see now, we are touching the concept of Flexbox. There's a concept of grid, which also uses the display property too. So that's how wide the display property is. So the ones we touched before were just like the standalone basic values. Now we are touching it as, within a concept. So here we have the components of Flexbox, and as you can see on the screen, Flexbox is actually made of two major components. First, we have the Flex container, and second, we have the Flex item. So these two are actually the main components of a Flexbox display. So we'll be seeing each of these concepts on their own individually in the next slide. So here we'll be looking at the Flex container and everything about it. So what is a Flex container? A Flex container can be described as the parent element in brackets div. So you can see that here they've already defined to us that the Flex container is a div element that contains various divisions within itself. So these divisions are still divs, because that's actually like, the actual word for the short form of div, that's divisions. So the divs that are inside the parent element div are actually known as the children element or the flex items. So here we can see the flex container is the parent element, the superior one, the one that surrounds the other elements. And then the children element within this parent element are still divs also. So that's how we have it here, you know, in the flex container. Now, how to use Flexbox. Flexbox is very easy to use. I believe we all saw how to use it, for those that were present in Thursday's class. But if you were not, no problem. Now, this is just a quick guide on how to use Flexbox. So the first thing you have to do is to define the Flex container. So now we already know that the Flex container is a div. I'm not so sure it's actually limited to that, but it's always better you use the div tag. Next, you would have to set the display property of the flex container to display flex. So you can see that here we are actually making use of the display property again, but now the display property is being assigned a value of flex under the flexbox concept. So it's pretty different with what we were seeing before, which is the block, inline block, and none. Here we are dealing with Flexbox, which makes use of this property and must be assigned the value of flex. And lastly, after you've done this, you can begin to style your flex container however you want. So the third step here is, is the major step. That's where you get to do all the good stuff. Now, in this section, we'll be seeing the properties of the Flex container. The Flex container has various properties, which include these six, but might not be limited to these six properties. It actually goes, on a larger scope. So it's beyond just the six of them. But having a knowledge of these six is very, very essential for anything you want to do relating to Flexbox, and it might be sufficient for you for now. Probably later on, while you keep improving yourself, you could also discover other properties that the Flex container is associated with. So now we have the six properties, and it begins with the first property, which is the Flex direction, which is followed by the Flex wrap, followed by the Flex flow. On the other side, we have the justify content, which is followed by the align items, and lastly the align content. So we'll be seeing each of these properties and how they work, and we'll also see how they actually perform. That's on VS Code. So first we have the flex direction. So the flex direction property describes the direction in which the flex container should arrange items. So like I said before, the flex container is the container element. By that we mean it's the one that holds other elements inside it. So this particular property is used to define how the flex container should, you know, arrange the items in what direction, which could be, horizontally or vertically. So we'll be seeing that later on. But for now, just know that this property is used to affect the direction of the arrangement of items. So here, this property accepts a particular set of values which include the following values. You can see the first value, we have the column value, which is followed by the column reverse. Next, we have the row value, followed by the row reverse. So these are the values that are accepted by the flex direction property, and would actually be seeing an example of each of these values when we get to the practical session of this Flexbox container. So a quick example here, you can see the syntax which is below the screen. The flex direction is assigned the value of column. So this is just one of the values among these four. And these four values actually work in different ways. Although the column and the column reverse work in the same way, likewise the row and the row reverse. But the arrangement of the item is what differs in the two, in the two categories. That's the row and the column. So we'll be seeing all of that later on. Next, we have the flex wrap. Now, this property defines if the item should be wrapped in the container or not. So what this basically means is that the flex container is a container element which is meant to hold these items within itself when rendered on the browser. But then it is very possible that even despite the fact it is meant to, hold them, it's possible for these elements to actually move out of, the container itself. And by doing so, the property of responsiveness would not be attached to Flexbox if that happens. So we'll be seeing what happens when, you know, we use this property, and we'll also see how to, fix that kind of situation. But just know now that the flex wrap defines if the item should be wrapped in the container or not. So the items probably have an option of being wrapped by the flex container or not, despite the fact that the container is meant to, wrap it normally. They actually have an option not to be wrapped under the flex container. So this flex wrap property accepts the following value. First, we can see the no wrap value, which is followed by the wrap value and the wrap reverse. So we'll be seeing how each of these value works when we get to the practical session of this Flexbox container. And a quick example here, you can see the syntax below the screen. The flex wrap is assigned the value of wrap. So what this particular wrap value will do, we'll see that later on. Next, we have the flex flow. The flex flow property is a shorthand property for the flex direction and the flex wrap properties. So by now, I believe we are not new to shorthand properties. We've seen some of these shorthand properties in previous classes. So the flex flow is one of them now, but under the flexbox concept. And a quick note, the order of definition for the flex flow actually begins with the flex direction and the flex wrap. So we can see so in the example we have below, the syntax, the flex flow is assigned two values, the column value and the wrap value. Now the column value is a flex direction value and the wrap is a flex wrap value. So this would actually, save time in terms of, defining the flex direction and the flex wrap of a flex container. So let's move on. Next, we have the justify content property. Now, this property is used to define the alignment of the flex items horizontally within the container. So what this property does here is that it actually defines the alignment of the items within the container, but only horizontally. So this actually means that you can't define the alignment of the flex item vertically with this. It only works horizontally, which happens to be from the left to the right and not from top to bottom. So that's how the justify content property actually works. Also, the justify content property has its own set of values it accepts. And as we can see, there are five values which, it might not be limited to, but at least these five values are the most used values. And you can see the first value to be the flex start, which is followed by the center value, followed by the flex end. And on the other section, we have the space around value and the space between. So no need to worry about this. We'll be trying out each of these values in each of these properties. So you'd be getting to see how each of these values actually work within the flex container. So a quick example here is the justify content being assigned the value of center. That's within the syntax at the base of the screen. So we'll also be trying this out very soon. For the fifth property, we have it to be the align items property, and it's also used to define the alignment of flex items like the justify content we just saw before. But this actually defines the alignment vertically and not horizontally within the flex container. So now you can see that the flex content defines the alignment horizontally, while the align items define the alignment vertically. So now we have two properties that can actually define the alignment of the flex items in separate ways. For the first one, it was horizontally, which is left to right, and for this property, it's vertically, that's from the top to the bottom. So next, the align item property accepts the following values, which are quite similar to the justify content, the flex start, the center, and the flex end. But some values here are quite different. We have the stretch value and we also have the baseline value. And as a quick example, the align item is assigned the value of flex start, which is within the syntax, in the last line of the screen. Last but not the least, we have the align content property. So the align content property is used to align the flex line of the flex container. So the flex line is basically the space you have between the flex items vertically. So you can actually style the amount of space between these two section of items in the container. Don't worry about this one. We'll see even this very soon on VS Code. And this property also accepts the following values: flex start, center, and flex end, like the justify content and align items. Also, it accepts the value of space around, space between, and stretch. So these are the list of value that this property accepts. And in the example here, you can see the align content is assigned the value of flex start. So without wasting time, we'll be seeing how each of these property actually works in Flexbox. Yeah, so you know what this section is all about already. We'll be going into VS Code to try all these properties and values out. Yeah, so back to VS Code. We are here again. Go back to our index.html. So for the display property, I believe we all know how it works. So I'll be taking off all of this. So here we have an empty document. So let's begin. We'll start with the div and we'll assign this a class name of flex container. Mind you, now this class name could actually be anything you want, but for better understanding and also in some organizational standard, it's always best you call it flex container. So we'll be having some divs within this container as we went about. So we'll have just four of this. Now, these four divs we have are actually known as the flex items or the children element. And this particular one here, that's this one with the class of flex container, is the parent element, also known as the flex container itself. So within this div, we are going to have some content. Let's say heading 3 with title, lorem 10. So we'll be making use of the lorem generator here. It's a random text generator. So don't worry too much about the Greek text you are seeing here. Is just a random text generator. You know, is basically used for prototyping until you actually have the content you want to put on your web page. So we'll be having this also. This will be changed to title 2. I'll change this to title 3 and title 4. So now we have four different titles within heading 3 elements and p tags. So for this, we'll go back to our style.css, would reference the parent um element, that's by the class name of flex container. So this will be called dot flex container, and we'll start by giving it the display value of flex. So the next thing we'll probably have is the background to make the container look, very obvious. It'll be dark gray. If we save this and visit our browser, yeah, so now we have flex items within this entire container. So let's really, create an obvious demarcation between each of these items, an obvious space, like a separation. We'll be using the flex container again, but then to be followed by a greater than sign and then the div. Now, this particular selector is a unique selector. It's actually called I think it's called the parent to child selector, because we know that the divs within the flex container are the children element. So to reference those elements with the parent element, this is how you do it with this greater than sign. So we define some properties for this. Would assign it a background color. Let's go with gray, which will be followed by a margin and a padding, probably just 10 pixels, padding of 15 pixels, font size. Hmm, probably make this just 18 pixels. And also, I think that's that. But we could also add a width to this, make this 100 pixels. So if we save this and we go back, yeah, so now we have flex items that are, obvious. Now you can see that the items within the container are actually obvious and they are all standing alone on their own. So this is just a simple example of the flex container and the flex items within the container. Okay, probably reduce this text a bit. Yeah, this should be okay. Okay, so the first property we'll be looking at will be the flex direction property, which actually tells us the direction the container should, follow in terms of the arrangement of the items. So for this, we'll go back to our CSS. I would actually have within the flex container, that's this section, would have the flex direction to be assigned the property of row. If we save this, we probably don't notice any difference in this, and that's because that's how it is by default. It actually follows the row, you know, the row value. So by default, without defining the flex direction for the flex container is row. So we'll be looking at the second value, which is the row reverse, and you would see a difference in terms of how the items are being arranged. So after saving this, going back to our browser, now you can see that the items are starting at the end of the flex container. That's at the right side of the screen, as opposed to when they were on the left side. So that's how the row and the row reverse values actually work. So you can see by default it has the row value, and when you assign it the row reverse, it starts at the opposite side of the container. So let's quickly see the next two values, which is the column value and the column reverse. So by using this value, it's not going to appear in a row form, it's going to appear column wise. So we'll be having this to look like this. Yes. So this is how you would have your flex items within the container when you set the flex direction to to column. And also, if we should perform the column wise, the column reverse, it's also going to give us the same result. Only difference is that the very first item becomes the last, and the last item becomes the first. That's why you have the title of 4, you know, here, which is followed by the title of 3, and then 2, and then 1. So that's how the flex direction actually works. And I think the arrangement also changes in the row reverse too. Let's quickly see that again. Yeah, it also does that too, with the text, the title of 4 starting, which is followed by title of 3, and then title of 2, and the title of 1, which becomes the last item here. So let's just leave it on the default value and look at the next property, which is the flex wrap. So under this property, we have the no wrap, the wrap, and the wrap reverse. So if we should set this to the no wrap value and save this, you can see that now it's on the default way it's meant to be. But if we should shrink this page, you would see the items leaving the container and they wouldn't stay within the container. So let's see how that plays out. So this is the container. If we should shrink this towards the side, now instead of the items to be retained within the container, they would actually leave the container gradually. And as you can see, they are going outside the container, with the container shrinking even further. So that's how the no wrap value actually works, and it's not very good to use this value. So we'd actually set this to the wrap value, and by doing so, the flex items would actually be maintained within the container. Okay, so I don't know how to begin this, but here we have it. So having it this way with this amount of space here, if we're to shrink this, instead of leaving the container, it is actually still maintained within the container. But the only thing here now is that it doesn't stay on the same line, it moves to the next line. So you can see the title 4 has moved below, and likewise with the 3 also when it gets to the end as we keep shrinking. And if we should even shrink further, yeah, you will have it to be in this way. So you have all the content within the container as it should be when you use the wrap value. So to the very end, they are all within the container, not leaving the space at all. And the last value here is the wrap reverse, which will do the same thing as the wrap. Only difference is that you would have the title 4 starting at the starting point during the reduction. Okay, so here if we keep shrinking, the title 4 becomes the first, which is okay. Yeah, it just keeps going. And yeah, so this actually changes the order of arrangement while it's wrapping. So it wraps this way instead of having it orderly. So that's what the wrap reverse does. So let's see the next property, and that is the flex flow. So like we know before, the flex flow is a shorthand property for both the flex direction and the flex wrap. So for this, we'll be having the flex direction to be row, and we'll be having the flex wrap to be wrap reverse. So we're going to comment this out. We should get exactly the same result we had before. So after saving this and visiting the browser, you can see it still remains the same. You know, it wraps completely to the very end, and it also maintains the reverse arrangement starting with the last item and ending with the first item. So it also does the same thing when you open it up. So that's how the flex flow actually works. So the next item we'll be seeing is the justify content, which aligns the item horizontally. So for this, the justify content will be set to the flex start, which is the default way it appears. Okay, we've not saved this. So you can see that it actually maintains the same space the way it is, but then it maintains the same space. It starts at the left hand side of the screen in terms of its alignment. So let's try it out with center. Okay, so now you can see that when applying the value of center, all the items are arranged in the middle of the flex container. So that's what the center value under the justify content property does. So you probably guess what the flex end would do. It would obviously take this to the you know end of the container, which is on the right side of the screen. So if we should apply that to flex end and save this, we have the items moving to this side. So by default, without setting this property, it's actually on the flex start. So without wasting time, let's quickly look at the other values we have. First value we have is the space around, and this particular value actually distributes the same amount of spaces on the right and left side of each of these items. So that's how the space align actually works. But mind you, in actual sense, this particular space you have here and also here is actually the same space you have in the middle here. The only reason why this space in the middle seems bigger than the space on the right, on the left side of, the flex container, and on the right side, is because of the margin we have attached to each of these items. So the margin, the space here is actually composed of this amount of space plus the margin of each of these two, you know, items. That's why the space here is actually more than this, but in real sense, it actually distributes the same amount of space around, each of the flex items. That's why the property is called space around. So the last one we'll be seeing will be the space between. And if we change this to space between, you would notice a significant difference in how the spaces are being distributed. Okay. Now you can see that the margin here, the margin below, and the margin above is being maintained completely. But now you have the rest of the excess space to be shared evenly among each of these items. But now you have the space shared between them and not around them, which is why you don't have this particular amount of space, you know, at the beginning of this title one. That's here where the margin is, and you also don't have it at the end of title 4, but rather you have it in between the items here, here, and here. So that's how each of these values under the justify content actually works. So we'll be resetting this for us to, practice with the align items. We have the align items value, and it also has the align items property, and it also has the value of flex start. We save this and go back. Now the align item by default has the value of flex start, which is why we can't see a difference here. It's still the way it was, the very first time we created this container. But we should align this value of center. It's going to create a space that's horizontally, I mean vertically and not horizontally. So the reason why we can't see this is probably because the flex container doesn't have a height property being set. So let's quickly do that. We'll give this a height of 500 pixels. Okay, probably this is too much. I would like everything to be on the same screen. Okay, a little too much still. Okay, so this is what the align item does when you assign it the value of center. So you can see now that we have equal amount of space above and below each of the flex items. So by default, it's actually the item is actually on flex start, and that's why you have it, that's why you had it at the top, you know, at the left hand side of the container. So the next value would be trying out is the flex end. Okay, you know what? Since we've given this a height, let's begin with flex stats again. And now you would see an actual difference in how the items will appear within the container. So having this to be on flex stats, the items now are here below. There's a space at the top here. So that's how it works with the align items, because the align items actually aligns the flex items horizontally. That's from top. Oh, sorry, not horizontally, vertically from top to bottom. So we've already seen how it does when you assign it the value of center. It would push it to the middle of the entire height of the container. And last, we'll be seeing this be end. And as you can see, you have this at the top of the container. So you can see that the start and end value here is quite the opposite of the start and the flex start and the flex end value in the justify content. So the flex start value under justify in align items is actually called the flex end, and their rules like that are reversed because of how the alignment is being done. So the next one we'll be seeing would be the stretch value. The align item will be assigned the value of stretch, and this would actually stretch the entire flex item to the margin of the flex container. So if we should do this, you wouldn't have it to be this way again. You wouldn't have this particular space here. You would actually have this each of these items to be stretched to the end, just the same way we have it at the top. So this is what you can see it. So this is what the stretch value actually does. It pulls it to the very end of the margin. So now we have equal margin at the top and at the bottom, and we have this amount of space here. So let's quickly look at the very last property, which is the align like content. So the align content here aligns the flex line of the flex container. So for us to see this properly, we would have to increase the number of items we have within our container, which I'll be doing quickly. Okay, so for now we have it to be like this. And okay, the flex isn't wrapped, so let's wrap it up. Yeah, so we have it to be like this now. Okay, and the reason why the wrap isn't working is probably because we already defined the height of the container. So we'll increase the container to explain this align content property. Okay, so we have it to be like this, and you can see there's a space in between the first set of content and the second set below it. So this is the part of the container that actually gets the styling. So for now, without wasting time, would assign the align content the value of flex start and which I guess is the default value. Okay, it's not the default value. And now you can see we have all the items being pushed down to the right, and the space here is still maintained. And likewise, if we assign it the value of flex end, it would also do the opposite. Yeah, and the items will be pushed at the top with this amount of space here, and then you have this particular space still retaining its form. But the next thing we'll do now is to assign the value of center. If we save this and go back to our browser, you actually have, the content to be in between at the very center of, the items are at the very center of the container. So I think that's that for align content. We also have the space around and space between, which does, basically the same kind of thing the justify content does too. Yeah. So now you can see that the space we have here dividing these two sections is actually a lot bigger than when we use the center, the flex start, and the flex end value. So that's what the align content actually does. It allows us to, define the amount of space we want here, dividing these two. Now, you can see that it wasn't so obvious when we tried it with the flex start, the flex end, and the flex center. The space here was still maintained. But with the space around property, you can see a huge amount of space is separating these two sets of flex items. So that's how we can actually do this with the align content property by using the space around. So you probably guess that if we change this to space between, you should have even more space separating the two of them. See, yeah, so now you can see that both contents maintain the margin top here, that's above this set of flex items, and there's a huge amount of space separating both of them, and the other section of flex items maintain the margin here at the bottom. So that's how we have it using the flex around and the flex between on the align content property. And yeah, I think okay, we still have one more, which is the stretch. So this will stretch, each of the flex items. Yeah. So the stretch stretches each of them, and it gives this amount of space here, which is quite similar with the flex start, flex end, and flex center in terms of the space dividing, you know, these two section of what's it called, flex items. Wow, we really spent a lot here. Now, for the final part, we'll be touching the flex item itself. What is a flex item? A flex item, as we all know, can be described as a child element that appears within a flex container. So we've already seen what a flex item is in the demo we had on VS Code. Now we'll be seeing the properties of a flex item. The flex item actually is associated with six properties, which could be the order property, the flex grow, the flex shrink, the flex basis, the flex, and the align self. So without wasting our time, we'll just quickly look at each of these properties, and we'll get to see how they all perform on VS Code. So the order property, this defines the order of appearance of the flex item. So this is quite similar with the flex direction. The only difference here is that here you get to define which particular item should come first, second, third, fourth, however you want it. You can actually do that using the order property. And the order property makes use of integer values. So by default, all flex items have the order property assigned the value of 0. And because they are all the same, the flex container would actually arrange them according to how they appear on your editor. But here you can actually define which particular item comes first, second, or third. So in the example we have here, the other properties assign the value of 1 in the syntax. So it means that if we should have this on VS Code, if we should add a particular flex item with this property on VS Code, it's going to be the last item and not the first. And why is because the other items actually have the default value of 0, and on the number line 0 comes before 1. So it is going to look through all the zeros. Once it's done, it can then begin with the value of 1. So for us to have a flex item that has the order of 1 to be our first item, that would mean that it has to other values has to be assigned values greater than 1. So we'll be seeing how this actually works later on. Next, we have the flex grow property. This particular property defines the rate of growth of the flex item relative to other items. So if we notice very well, when we're shrinking the flex container, we also saw the items shrinking together, and that's because the flex shrink by default is also 0. But if you have the flex, oh sorry, we are talking about the flex grow here. So the flex grow property defines the rate of growth of the flex item relative to other items. So what this basically does is that when you have a smaller um flex container, you begin to expand it. If you noticed in the demo we had on flex container, the items appear smaller when the container is smaller. But as the container gets bigger, the item also appears to get bigger. But then we can actually define the growth of how this item, should get. So assigning any flex item with this syntax we have here, which the flex grow is assigned the value of 5, would actually make that particular item to grow 5 times the normal growth of other items. So that's what this property actually does. Next, we have the flex shrink, which I was talking about until I then realized it was flex grow we had. So the flex shrink property defines the rate of shrinkage of a flex item relative to other item. So this basically does the opposite of the flex grow. So if you probably have a big container and you begin to reduce the size, by default, all the sizes of the flex items would also get reduced as the container is reducing. But when this particular property is assigned an integer value, especially if it's greater than 1, it actually gets to shrink even faster than the other values. So by default, the flex shrink property actually has the value of 1 for every flex item. So if you have a flex item with a greater value of 1, that particular item would shrink even faster than the other ones. So that's what this property does. Next, we have the flex basis property, and this property is used to set an initial length of the flex item. So normally you might be wondering why we can't use the width property to set the length. Actually, if you try to use the width to set the length of a flex item, it won't work. It can only work with the flex basis, and that's why the flex basis is very important. So in the example we have, the flex basis is assigned the value of 100 pixels. That's this example we have below the screen. Next, we have the flex property. Now, this property is a shorthand property for the flex grow, the flex shrink, and the flex basis property. So the three properties we've seen can actually merged, in this property, and you can have the values of three of them right here. So the flex property is actually defined in the order of the flex grow, the flex shrink, and the flex basis. So in the example we have, the three that we actually see here is actually the flex grow, which means it should grow three times the normal or the default value. But also we have the next value of 5, which actually means it's going to shrink. It would shrink 5 times faster than the default values of other flex items. And here we have a flex basis of 100 pixels, which would actually set the width of the flex item to 100 pixels. So we'll be seeing all of these demonstrations on the VS Code very soon. Lastly, we have the align self. The align self property is used to set the alignment of a particular item in the flex container. Now, the align items property of the flex container is actually used to order the alignment of each of these items. But with the align self, we can actually order the particular alignment of a property within, that's a particular item within the other items of the container. So you probably don't want everything to be aligned the same way. You can define specific alignments using the align self property. So setting this property will actually override the default alignment on that item. So if it has a default alignment by the flex container, you can use this particular property to override that. So as we have in the example, the align self is assigned the value of flex end. So we'll be seeing a quick demo on this in a bit. Yeah, so here we'll be seeing how the flex item works. So without wasting time, let's quickly do this. So here we have our children elements or flex items. And as you can see, they appear in the order of title 1, 2, 3, 4. We change this to 5, also this to 6, this to 7, and the last would be 8. Yeah. So for the sake of this, we'll be using the inline styling method. We wouldn't be following the normal way we've been doing it using the external CSS, which is this. So you can actually define the item you want to come first. And let's start with this particular div for title 4. So we'll have this to begin with style. This is actually how we all know how to do the inline styling. It begins with the style syntax. Then we change the order of this. We set this to be the value of 1. If we save this and go back to our browser, you can see now you have the value of 4 here. Okay, let's shrink this a bit. Okay, I think it's actually on row reverse. That's why, yeah, wrap reverse. So we'll remove this. We'll set the flex wrap to be on wrap. So going back here, you can see that the flex item with the title of 4 is actually the last item on the screen here. And this is actually because the rest of them from title 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 actually have the default value of 0. So if we probably want this title 4 to be the very first value, it means that we would have to assign, you know, values greater than 1 to each of these other flex items. So let's quickly do that. So yeah, the title of 5 would have the order order of 2. Okay, you know what, let's just do with the first 4. So comment this out. So here we have the order of 1. For title 1 would have this to be the order of 2. Title 3 will have this to be the order of 4. Let's make this the last. So the order of 3 would be in title 2. And now we are going to have this to start with title 4, title 1, title 2, and title 3. So if we save this and visit our browser, yes, so there we have it, 4, 1, 2, 3. So you can actually define what item begins and what item ends and how you want the arrangement to be in between. So that's what the order property does. And like I said, the order property only affects the flex item. It doesn't have anything to do with the container at all. So the next we'll be seeing is the flex grow. So for the title of 1, we would have the flex grow here. By default, the flex grow is 0. So we'll have this to be the flex grow of 1. We'll also reduce the height of our container. So going back to the browser, you can see the title 1 now has a bigger width than the rest of the items. So let's arrive at when it was the same with them. We'll shrink this. Okay, so this is how you would have it, and the flex wrap isn't on because we've defined a height. So I don't think we should worry about this, but then if we want, we can remove this for the flex wrap to work. Okay, so now everything is wrapped up inside the flex container, and you can see the initial value for this is actually bigger than the rest of them. So as we begin to increase the size of you know the browser, okay, right now they are all the same, and this is because the space of each of these items can actually be distributed to fit in that item that has the flex group property. Now, the flex group property is still present in that item. It's not obvious here because it can actually accommodate the same space the rest of them have. But as we begin to increase the size of this, it begins to, the rate at which this one is growing is a lot faster than the rest of them. So that's how it's going to be to the very end. So if we probably have a display even bigger than this laptop screen, it's going to keep increasing at the rate at which the others would increase, only that it would be faster, you know, in increasing. Next, we have the flex shrink. So we change this to flex shrink. The default value is actually 1, but if we change this to 0, it's actually going to shrink a lot slower than the rest of them. So going back here, you can see now they are all the same sizes. But if we begin to reduce the size of this browser, okay, this is probably not so obvious because the space we have is a lot. Okay, let's see. Let's probably increase this to 8. I would also increase the width to something bigger so we can actually notice the difference. Okay, so now we have this. We start reducing each of this. Now you would actually notice that the one with title 1 is is actually still maintaining its width, while the others are getting reduced quickly. So that's how the flex shrink actually works. And it's also leaving the browser. So you probably won't want to make use of this property, but that's how it works. So the rate at which a particular item will be shrinking would actually be faster than the other items. So without wasting time, we'll quickly touch the flex basis, which is used to set an initial length of the flex item. So saving this and going back to our browser, we have all items to maintain the same width, but then we give this a flex basis. Okay, let's reduce this back to the way it was, 100 pixels. Now we'll give this a flex basis of 200 pixels. Save this. Okay, so now you can see the title 1 actually has an initial length of 200 pixels. So it's two times wider than the other, text flex items. So next we'll be seeing the flex shorthand, which is a shorthand for the flex basis, the flex grow, and the flex shrink. So for the title 1, we'll still have the flex to be assigned growth of 3, going to shrink at the value of 5, and it's going to have a flex basis of 200 pixels. So looking at this, it still remains the same. But if we begin to shrink this, even while others are shrinking, it still maintains. And just you can see others have actually gotten here, which is their original width, but this still maintains its width, which is actually 3 times the width of the other items, and should also shrink a lot faster, which is why you actually noticed this particular flex item shrinking and the others weren't shrinking. So that's how the flex shorthand works. And also the align self, which is the align self is the last property here. So we have this to be this way. We'll be applying the align items here. Okay, we'll have to give this a height. So which means we are not going to make use of this flex wrap anymore. Okay, so now the items are, you know, they are here now at the margin bottom. So what we are going to do is we are going to style one of these items to actually be at the center of this entire container, just one. So for us to do that, using inline styling, we would actually have the align self to be center, and it's actually going to take this particular flex item with the title of 1 and whatever it has there at the center of the flex container, as opposed to how other items were aligned. So this is what actually happens here. You can see that this particular flex item is at the middle of the flex container, and the rest of them still maintain the flex end. So I think that's that for flex item and flex container and flexbox too. I hope with this you're able to get, an essential knowledge of on how the flexbox actually works. So I think that's the end for this class. Thank you.